Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. This week's guest is Randall Winston. When he and I first sat down for this interview this past summer, Randall was serving as executive director of the Strategic Growth Council. I want to share the conversation we had because Randall is a person of unique energy and vision. He also has a pretty unique background. He earned his master's in architecture from the University of Virginia after completing his BA at Harvard, and he brings this perspective of the built environment to his work. The agency he ran, the Strategic Growth Council, brings together multiple agencies and departments to support sustainable communities, emphasizing strong economy, social equity, and environmental stewardship. Randall previously worked in Governor Jerry Brown's office, helping to lead efforts to implement executive orders on green buildings, zero-emission vehicles, and he also did a lot of work on international climate policy, particularly on China, where he lived and worked for some time. And I have to credit Randall with conceiving of the California Leadership Series. When I called to ask him to be one of my first guests on the podcast, he pushed me on my vision for the podcast, until the idea of this initial series focused on California leadership at the state level came out. While Randall is now tucking in to earning his law degree at Berkeley, I have no doubt that we'll be hearing about him in the years to come. And I hope we do. Our struggle for a sustainable future needs him. Randall Winston, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today. I want to start by sort of digging into your formative experiences. Mm-hmm. If you could talk a bit about kind of what brought you to an interest in environmentalism, what was that initial spark, and what was sort of the context that you came into this work through?
That's a great question. And, the colleagues that I work with, I think have all come here through different paths, and mine is maybe no different. I, during my undergrad, studied politics and political philosophy. I think I'd started out sort of post-high school, eager to dive further into politics, not knowing entirely what the field entailed beyond a sort of inspirational, aspirational sense, being 18 or 19. Got a chance to work in D.C. for, former Senator Kennedy, for former Secretary of Defense Cohen, all within a sort of political context, passing through 9/11, which put, a different global context on things. Became increasingly interested in philosophy, actually. And I think where I started to see the tie to sustainability, the environmental sort of field broadly, was when I dug further into philosophy, and this is through continental 19th century philosophical thought, this guy named Soren Kierkegaard. I was like, okay, how do I combine this different field with this interest in politics? Interned for my local Congressman Joe Baca down in San Bernardino. This was in the run-up to what became the housing crisis. He was doing work in urban parts of San Bernardino, trying to help first-time home buyers buy a home, do so with limited means, working with parts of the financial industry, law enforcement to revitalize communities. And it put this collection of ideas in my own mind about, okay, I've got here my own little burgeoning interest in philosophy and politics, not sure how to combine them. Politician working in the community, trying to sort of tie together socioeconomic ideas, thoughts about how communities form, the long-term sustainability of those communities, with clear changes that need to be made on the policy front, which entailed politics. So it was a sort of a collection of ideas that came together in a way that I didn't quite know how to combine, but I knew that I wanted to in the context of politics, policy, and long-term sustainability. I think environmentalism came into sharp contrast, though, with those elements during the next phase of my little career, where I spent a couple of years in China. So I knew I needed to dive into understanding those elements that I just described, and having a bit of sort of wanderlust as a young guy. I was like, okay, let me dive into China. It was at the time during the run up to the 2008 Olympics. I had a chance to work for a developer there and see, in a really stark way, the effects of sort of a massive move from the rural parts of China to larger cities like Beijing, environmental impacts, both in terms of water quality, certainly air quality, living conditions. It was sort of across the board. And a much sharper contrast than what we, I think, experience here, certainly that I experienced in the United States. And all of that was in this mix of rapid urbanization. And so I was able to see kind of the intersection of a upwardly mobile group of folks. These are sort of rural individuals getting jobs and finding mobility. A government in Beijing and in China trying to keep up with the rapid change of environmental and land use laws, because I was working for a developer, and not being able to do at sometimes the best job of it. But the market's moving at a rapid clip, regardless. And so, the challenge was how can, when we're trying to, achieve economic growth, trying to achieve sort of, I'll just say equity socioeconomically, when you've got such sort of, mass urbanization, how can we achieve some of those goals and at the same time ensure that we're doing so sustainably from an environmental perspective? And in a lot of ways, it was not being done well in Beijing. In a lot of ways, it was being done well. And again, I think it sort of put into contrast for my own self how to go about pursuing that in the United States.
And then you brought some of that China experience to your work in California. We'll talk about that in a minute. But just going back to your formative years, I understand that you were quite involved, and I think still are, in the YMCA Youth in Government program. Can you talk a little bit about that? Was that sort of a catalyst for you in your interest in public service?
Oh, you're taking it way back. Without question. If I were to put into a sentence what California YMCA did for me, was that it inspired me to have a passion for public service in the most straightforward, but yet I think the deepest way of what that means. I'm on the board of the California YMCA Youth in Government now, but at the time, back when I was 15 is when I first got involved, was sort of an officer in the statewide program. And it's a statewide program that essentially models the legislative and court process here in California, giving young people, high school students, an opportunity to play the role of senator, assembly member, youth governor, all the elected officials, in a way that is both instructive, educationally, and on a social front. You're interacting with peers who, for a lot of the time, are, they might not know who they are, just from a sort of an identity standpoint. It's a formative time in one's life. Certainly, I could say that about myself. So it's powerful in a multidimensional sort of way. I ended up being elected youth governor when I was 16. And the program had at the time about, 2,000 to 3,000 students all across California. So it was exposure beyond just my little town where I grew up, which was in the Inland Valley, Redlands, right next to San Bernardino, experiencing what young folks' experience was like in LA, in the Central Valley, in the Bay Area, SF, Oakland. Had a chance to participate in national conferences of youth and government in North Carolina and traveled throughout the South. So it gave me a love for public service, what it meant to contribute to working to change folks' lives, but in a collective way. And by that, I mean, it's not just about, your ideas as a leader, but understanding what servant leadership means in working with individuals of diverse backgrounds and trying to channel their ideas, beliefs into, policies and real change. Again, this was done in a younger person's context, but it stayed with me.
But it's important, and you continue to be involved in shepherding other young people. Do you think that we're losing some of that idealism or some of that sense of servant public service, given the political divisions that we're experiencing in the country now?
And I it's a subject of not a little debate amongst a lot of my peers. I think from one perspective, there is a degree of cynicism, I think, that's been sort of injected in our public discourse that has, I think, chipped away at some of that idealism, and it's unfortunate. I do, though, think that young people, I think, hold the promise of being able to reignite that idealism. What's happened in our previous presidential election in 2016, I think, was a wake-up call to a lot of individuals on all sides of all aisles, and reminding folks, I think, of the importance of being civically engaged and civically minded, because who we vote for matters, and the laws that are passed matters, and it affects not just our lives but our culture, the way in which we can discuss with one another and agree or not to agree on what makes sense in terms of bringing our country and our communities where it needs to be. I think it was sort of a reactivation of the importance of public discourse and what conscientious, reasonable discourse entails. So I have hope. I'd say that my hope is maybe what sort of just mitigated by a realism of the difficulty of our public discourse at present. I think young people, though, hold in many ways the keys to keeping that kind of idealism alive. And look, I've long been a believer in a quote, and I'm not going to get it right, but it's a J.F. Quaid quote about how democracy has to be learned by every generation. To my mind, idealism and the way in which we gauge politically entails the same sort of effort. It is new, and it is a new undertaking for every generation. And to take that for granted is I think wrong-headed. And so, is it challenging? Yes. Is it going to be, I think, a difficult task for this generation to understand what democracy, public service engagement actually entails? Absolutely. But that, to me, is part of what this democratic experiment is.
So you took an interesting turn. I'm not sure if this came before your work in China or after.
Mm-hmm.
But you're an architect by training, aren't you?
Yes. So another interesting turn indeed. So I'd spoken to kind of philosophy and politics and experience in the built environment. Architecture sort of emerged as a profession that I wanted to pursue following my time in China. Actually, I'd worked there for an urban developer and for an architect. And I think, to my mind, it boiled down to wanting to get a better understanding of the sort of the constitutive elements of the built environment, and not to sort of put it in too highfalutin language, but space. I kind of see ethics and aesthetics alongside one another in the formation of our public space, of our public discourse. And architecture, I think, contributes tremendously to shaping how we engage publicly. It's background. It's not something that people have at the fore of their minds, or they think of at the fore of their minds, but the way in which...
it is if they're not comfortable, right? If their space isn't conducive to health and to work and to community, it can be very obvious.
Absolutely. And I, obviously couldn't agree more. So I did spend, 3 years getting my master's in architecture. Was actually at the University of Virginia, and had a strong interest, and still do, in Thomas Jefferson, our founder and slave owner, and not uncontroversial figure, who I think in a lot of ways represents some of the tensions that underlie this American experience, in terms of race, certainly liberalism, architecture, ethics. What this sort of going back to the quote I mentioned earlier about democracy must be re-envisioned anew by each generation. I think he in many ways embodies that ethos, both from the sort of critically, meaning there are, I think, aspects of his career and of his approach that one can certainly criticize, and we do, but aspects that are without question aspirational and inspirational. And so, he sort of stands as almost like a foil in my mind in some ways, where there are elements that I think as Americans we look to for, and I continue to look to for inspiration, but some that sort of befuddle me, maybe for obvious reasons, given the way he lived his life, up in his little hill in Monticello with his slaves, and what all that's been written about his, I think, conflicted person.
So, in what ways are you? Do you see that playing out now in your career? I mean, do you sort of have Thomas Jefferson on one shoulder, egging you on, or pointing the way in some ways?
I almost would say if we, it's a sort of Jefferson, I feel like, and like a lot of the other founding fathers, but Jefferson in particular is knitted into our fabric as a nation, and race in particular comes to my mind. So a lot of what we do now, and I know we're going to get to this in a bit in the programs that I run, particularly looking at community development, revitalization, how in a lot of the parts of California, particularly in our most vulnerable communities, you have people of color marginalized, and not being able to take part in a lot of the land use decisions that have put them in places that have worse air quality, have environmental pollution, and sort of severe impacts caused by those decisions around siting, et cetera. The question comes to my mind is, when you have decades of history that have created those conditions, you have racial division, inequity. How do you go about not just sort of healing those divides, but articulating and pursuing a vision that sort of looks beyond it, and again, getting back to our sort of our climate charge, actually transforms the way in which we live, that can lead us to again act and live more sustainably, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. And jumping back to what you had mentioned earlier about Jefferson and race, and something that's now so long ago, or seemingly so long ago, well over 200 plus years ago. I think that a lot of the same issues are actually at their core. The differences that we see in and amongst one another, the differences that we sometimes look over if our background isn't like the background of those who might be less fortunate. Race continues to play, I think, a substantial role in the way in which we think or frame our decisions. And I think we need to constantly be vigilant about that reality, in order to find ways to build bridges and work together. And on the ground, it is absolutely not as easy as it sounds.
It's not, and we'll circle back to this, but I think that the current administration in California, really led on various issues of environment, including climate, but more recently has really come around to issues of environmental justice and equity. And I know that some of your work has really been leading that. So talk to me about how you came to California and what the first phase of your work in the governor's office was.
So I came to California through a program called the Capital Fellows Program. I was an executive fellow coming out of actually New York. I was working for an architecture firm there, Norman Foster. It's this British firm that sort of is behind a lot of the large sort of kind of highly technical and kind of, I'd say, green architectural infrastructure.
They did the Apple spaceship, right?
That is correct. The Apple campus, a few other projects, but yeah, that's definitely a big one here in California. I was looking for ways to marry this sort of what became my background in architecture directly with politics. Governor Brown got elected, as you know, late 2010, started in 2011, and I just had to get back here. The kind of the crisis, the economic crisis that California was in at the time, I found to be actually really exciting. It was an opportunity. I saw as a challenge, really, an opportunity to help maybe turn things around. I felt that Brown had the experience and the background to maybe do it. And so I came here as a fellow, was placed in the governor's office, worked with his environmental advisors. In 2012, Governor Brown signed a couple of executive orders. There was one on green buildings, one on zero emission vehicles. And so had the opportunity to be involved in helping to implement both of those executive orders. When I was a fellow, it was just for about, 9 or so months. And then was thankful to have been brought on full-time as an appointee, working with the governor's chief of staff, so Nancy McFadden. And my portfolio was sort of expanded from there. So kind of kept the components with zero emission vehicles and green buildings, but expanded out into international climate policy. The governor wanted to lead a delegation and trade mission to China, stemming from a couple of agreements that had been signed earlier in his administration. And so I had a chance to help pull together that trade mission and agreements that kind of became foundational agreements for where we are now, but with the Ministry of Finance, the Environmental Ministry, NRDC, which is the National Reform and Development Commission, and really exciting set of opportunities. So that was about, 3.5 to 4 years in the governor's office, where other than those, it was sort of as one does when you're, I think, operating in an office in an environment like that. A lot of what you do is sort of, this is a task or an emergency that needs to get done yesterday. Get it done. And so learned a lot about Governor Brown's style, his cabinet, and the way in which I think he surrounds himself with individuals who are strong-minded, whip smart, and Governor Brown is comfortable with, I think, conflict and argument amongst those individuals in a way that is constructive, and I think leads to better ideas, which in turn leads to better policies, better outcomes. And if you have the staff and the individuals to actually implement, then I think that system works really well.
So in Governor Brown's administration, you talk about a culture of debate and of hiring very strong-minded people. So how do you balance that? Because I also get the sense that people are very, very loyal, are excited to go to work. What are some of the challenges of trying to maintain that type of high-charge culture? And is it successful?
So, I'll answer that in two ways. Number one, I would be remiss if I didn't throw in another dimension, which is really important, and that's the sort of multi and intergenerational nature of his office. So, Governor Brown, now 80 when he was elected, early 70s. You had a slate of individuals who had served with Governor Brown when he was 36, when he first was elected governor, who were young, much younger than they are now, idealistic. And I said they aren't idealistic now, but maybe more so at the time, new ideas, bringing a different kind of energy. This time around, you have, I think, individuals who are Governor Brown's age, individuals who served with Governor Brown and were even younger than Governor Brown at that time, individuals who are maybe kind of, late, considered late in their careers, but that's not late by Governor Brown's terms, 50s, early 60s. You have a crop of individuals who are like myself coming in their, in their late 20s, 30s. And so that intergenerational mix of perspectives, I think, injected a really interesting dynamic amongst these strong minds. I think it worked well because, and this is getting to the second part, because of, frankly, the way in which Governor Brown, his chief of staff, the first lady, how they were able to, not just sort of frame those discussions, but frankly tolerate them. It takes a certain degree of patience and tenacity to be able to really listen. And when you have individuals disagreeing loudly, and individuals who you trust, sometimes I think it can be easy to sort of take sides, listen to outside interests, or not really sort of see through to the end, what one's position or set of arguments might lead to. And, I credit Governor Brown and his office for having the patience, really, and I think the intellectual fortitude to be able to see that through. Listening is much harder than I certainly had given it credit for before I came to that office, and what it really means to, regardless of where you're from, the ideas, and this actually applies intergenerationally, whether it was myself giving an idea at the table or others who were far more experienced and older than I was or am, still being able to listen to an idea for what it is worth and see it through. And that's something that Governor Brown actually does in a way that is kind of, I think, shockingly refreshing. And for a lot of people, a little bit shocking.
Well, because his method, as I understand it, and I've only interacted with him a couple times, but of listening is sort of a method of inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
Of inquisition, maybe even.
Oh yes, and so that's another element. I don't mean to make it sound so so friendly as as it maybe is. No, I think he's sort of known to have a somewhat Socratic way of questioning, some might say interrogating, not really individuals, but ideas. Bringing ideas to their task, and I think he has an almost preternatural ability to kind of cut through rhetoric and what one might describe as kind of fluff. In other words, if you think you know if you think you can get away with sort of operating at the surface of an issue just because you're a good decision maker or a good manager, that will not cut it. Know what you're talking about, or don't, and find someone who does know what they're talking about. And make sure that you stand by your ideas and what you believe in a way that's evidence-based and defensible, and be ready to nonetheless defend and sort of be taken to task. It's almost adversarial, and these are conversations behind closed doors where it's not, this isn't sort of debates for public consumption. It's sort of trying to get to what is the best solution given, look, California is incredibly diverse, highly pluralistic place where we've got, agendas across the board, even though we've got a democratically controlled legislature. It is split dozens, if not hundreds of ways across every set of issues. And the patience, and as I mentioned, the kind of intellectual fortitude it takes to really think through those positions is substantial. And I, again, give credit to this administration and Governor Brown for really being able to kind of steer those discussions to, I think, and I would like to think, are better outcomes.
A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. So here we are at Strategic Growth Council, which is sort of an adjunct to, is it an adjunct to the Office of Planning and Research, or is it completely separate?
Yeah, so it's, and it's a little bit confusing. We're technically a part of the Office of Planning and Research, so under the same umbrella, but we operate, via our own council. Council has 10 members. We've got, 6 of whom are, either cabinet secretaries or the director of the Office of Planning and Research, and then appointees by the governor, by the assembly speaker, and then the president pro tem of the Senate.
And you've been executive director here now for 2 years. Is that about right?
Goodness, it's going on 3.
Is it?
Yeah, so it'll be 3 in June, and it's been an incredible experience that came from, I mentioned earlier on, kind of wrapped up my experience in Governor Brown's office after about 4 years, and then came here.
So describe, since the council is, I don't think, widely known to many people, I'd like to know really what the central pillars of the council's work is, as well as what your day-to-day responsibilities are.
Mm-hmm. So the council is pretty young by way of state agencies, actually. It was just formed in 2008 on the heels of AB 32 and the Global Warming Solutions Act, charged really with thinking through how, from the perspective of where and how we grow our land use, how can we do so in a way that is sustainable and links up with achievement of our climate goals, which had been set, right? We had 2020 and 2050 goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think it was understood that if we continued along the path of land use, urban sprawl, not really focusing in on infill development, then that would, at best detract from achievement of our goals, at worst sort of veer us down a path that would really put us in danger of not achieving our greenhouse gas reduction goals and helping us live healthier, more vibrant, active lives. So that was our broad charge. After the Global Warming Solutions Act, there was another law that's really important, SB 375, which essentially put our state's metropolitan planning organizations, these large regional entities, previously charged predominantly with transportation planning, put them on the hook for developing these things called sustainable community strategies. And these strategies had to, not just come up with targets for greenhouse gas reduction that were aligned with our 2020, 2050 goals, but also, and really for the first time, start to coordinate with their local jurisdictions in their sort of regional areas, housing and transportation. So in other words, how could they think through ways in which their regions grew that met our climate goals and aligned with our state's infill development goals. So infill-oriented development, the avoidance of sprawl when possible, still being able to grow economically. You have a problem, though, there, and that is that land use control is local. It remains local. These metropolitan planning organizations, don't have land use control. So you had this sort of position where they develop sustainable community strategies, sort of, I think, ambitious goals for their region, but local governments not being required to follow those plans. Many do, many did. They didn't have to. In comes the Strategic Growth Council. And I think, one of the roles, I think the key roles that we play, beyond that sort of high level charge that I mentioned earlier, is being able to work directly with local governments and regional bodies in helping to achieve those sort of regional strategies for growth.
So is that sort of a mediation role in some cases?
So I think in some cases it is. When it comes down to the nuts and bolts of it, though, I think it involves incentives and, being able to provide funds for planning, for capital projects, and for direct assistance, technical assistance, capacity building, support in helping jurisdictions get there. I think oftentimes we'll work with a city who might just say, look, we've been growing this way for many years, if not decades, meaning, let's say, greenfield development and sort of single-family residences that are taking up, I don't know, an acre, 1.5 acre. It's difficult to change that. We don't see how we can align with the state's goals. Thanks, but no thanks. It is. I think those situations are really where we come in. How can we work with those jurisdictions, bring not just funding to bear, but, our expertise to bear to help them along a pathway. And it's different for different parts of the state, as be it in the Central Valley, in predominantly rural parts of the state, in the Inland Valley down south. Different strategies are needed, but I think it's incumbent upon us to really figure out how to help those jurisdictions grow in a way that involves less sprawl, looks to revitalize downtowns that have maybe been ignored.
Have you seen some successes in those kind of communities that really have been growing in the opposite direction that the state needs them to grow in?
I think so. I think we really have. It's going to take a while, but I think we're starting to change the conversation, and many times project by project in a lot of these jurisdictions. I'll point to an example in Fresno where we've done a tremendous amount of work over the years with the Office of Planning Research, and with some grant funding, we helped to update their general plan, which hadn't been updated in decades. And Fresno is one of these cities, not like a lot of other cities, not just in California but around the nation, that long ago had kind of turned their back in terms of economic development on their downtown. Sprawl, the march of sprawl, had been sort of progressing literally for decades, creating rings around metropolitan Fresno and new sort of bedroom communities around it. So you had an increase in vehicle miles traveled, where the distances that folks traveled to get to their jobs increased. Increasing amount of poverty in the inner core, which in turn was accompanied by racial and socioeconomic divisions, and no clear way or pathway to turn that around. I think due to some really strong leadership at the mayoral level some years ago, partnership with OPR and the Strategic Growth Council helped update that general plan, a new specific plan for downtown, and a vision for revitalizing Fresno as a community, and particularly their downtown. You have the state's high-speed rail, going through Fresno, and a high-speed rail station located there. And then most recently, over the past year and a half, the Strategic Growth Council is committed to investing $70 million through a newer program. It's called Transformative Climate Communities, that really focuses in on the most impacted or burdened communities, which are right in the downtown area. And while that program's interested in funding capital projects, affordable housing, transit, urban greening, et cetera, at its core, it's really about mobilizing community-based organizations and working directly with them and the city and other public institutions to come together in this sort of transformative vision for downtown. That's going to take time. It's not going to be a year. It's not going to be 2 years, but it's SGC partnering for 5+ years to see those projects through and hopefully see that transformation through.
So do you see Fresno as being exemplary of other communities in the state? And going back to the issues of equity and environmental justice that we were talking about before, a couple of years ago, there was really a divide between the way that some communities saw the climate issue and the way that other communities saw the climate issue. Where is that divide now? I have a sense that there has been some coming together, but I'm really looking at it from the outside. What is your sense, and to what extent does the work of the council in some of these communities intersect with those divisions?
So I think I would agree that in the sort of past few years, there's been a coming together of those divisions, but there's definitely still work to be done. To your first question, whether or not Fresno is kind of exemplary of some of those challenges, I'd say yes and no. And I'll answer the no part first, because I think one of the things that we believe in relatively strongly and try to sort of infuse or incorporate in our work is a place-based approach. Every community is different. I think every community is facing different challenges, has different levels of leadership, vision, or lack thereof on the part of elected officials. Different levels of leadership, vision, and engagement on the part of community members, and of course, from a geographic and land use standpoint, just different conditions. So we do believe that place-based approach, which means working directly with community groups, with leaders to articulate a vision, is critical, and that it really does mean rolling up our sleeves to figure out what those conditions are, and not assuming that a one-size approach is going to fit everyone. That being said, there's definitely lessons that we can learn, best practices that we can learn from where we have worked, like in Fresno, and bring them to bear in other communities, particularly insofar as how we think about community engagement and the role that communities, and particularly what we call sort of disadvantaged or the most disadvantaged communities, engage with local, state, regional governments, with the history in mind that they've been, I think, oftentimes not a part of those conversations. And so what does that mean insofar as bringing them to the table? I think it means, from a project standpoint, being clear about the role that those groups play in project implementation insofar as memorandums of understanding, agreements between those groups, and really being intentional about the inequities that might exist in a certain place, how, at least for the expenditure of our dollars, those inequities can be ameliorated or resolved over time, and making sure that we stay involved from a partnership perspective to hold all parties accountable, and being able to provide the capacity and resources where it's needed. So I think those lessons, insofar as how we structure our relationships with those various groups, are transferable, and I think we've seen some success, particularly with regard to environmental justice groups and community-based organizations, in, I think, there being hope in the state being able to emulate that model in other communities. With all due, I think, calls for patience and one step at a time. I don't think we can jump ahead far ahead too quickly, but I do think that we've made a good amount of progress on that front.
So I want to shift back for a second to career more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
You've had such an interesting set of experiences, right? You bring a love of philosophy and experience in government and in architecture to this role within the state of California now. Can you talk a little bit about what careers you see being interesting that have high leverage points in terms of impacting environmental sustainability moving forward, both, I guess, within state government, but also more broadly? Where do you think kind of the hotspots are?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question, and I will start with government. I mentioned earlier my passion for public service, and that's sort of, I think, been pursued through government. I think that the distrust in government is real, and it's unfortunate. But I think that, as I mentioned earlier, particularly over the past few years, there has been a heightened interest in folks trying to figure out, okay, how can we change a lot of what we are seeing happening, both in terms of policymaking and legislation. And I think government is where that happens. So I do believe that pathways across government, be that in the executive branch, working for a department or an agency, in the courts, and working as an attorney, a lawyer, as an elected official, all of those pathways, I think, offer opportunities for change, and at different levels, not just the state or at the federal level, but locally. Local government is where things happen. It might not be as sexy as some of the other positions, but it really, to my mind, is where change starts. Outside of government, I'd name a number of other sectors. So if I were to look to the sort of the public interest in national government organization, non-governmental organization space, I think there are tremendous opportunities there. I think we're starting to see, sort of a lot more mixing between foundations and philanthropic entities, advocacy organizations, and partnerships with government business. These are sort of public-private partnerships models, but even beyond that, I think that there is a really exciting space for folks who are, I'll just say, sort of social entrepreneurs, to think through how to knit together those different groups, where you can bring resources that are outside of government to bear, financial resources. You can connect with community-based organizations, and then you can bring the heft, let's say, of a business or a think tank to problem solve. And that, I think, that can be done on a sort of a project by project basis, on a pilot basis. I think really the one's imagination is the limit there, and there's a lot of room to, I think, grow and expand in terms of innovative ideas. So I do think that's exciting. I continue to be intrigued by possibilities in the tech space. So we're in California, obviously the home of Silicon Valley. My classmates were actually the Facebook founders, and for a time, we didn't touch upon this career-wise, but I did work for Facebook's founding president for one of the applications back in the early 2000s.
This was an application focused on social good, wasn't it?
Correct. It's called Causes. Look, I think particularly thinking about social media, but I'll stick with just tech by and large. Obviously a space where there's so much innovation happening across the board. I think moving at a pace that government and in many cases even society has a difficult time keeping up with. That I believe that there is an opportunity for a lot more innovation with regard to public policy, government, and change making. And I think we're sort of seeing a number of shifts in conversations amongst tech taking place right now. Not, I think, sort of the the rosy view of limitless possibilities that maybe existed in, gosh, from 2009, 2010 up until at least 2015, 2016. I think that's sort of been, I think, mitigated by realities. Privacy concerns, obviously what's happened recently post 2016 in the election. I see that as an opportunity for those in that space to sort of engage even more. I'll just say realistically in how to think through tools and strategies to make change on the policy front. I think a lot has been tried. Some strategies or tools more successful than others. But I think that maybe the promise lies in partnerships, getting back to what I mentioned earlier, where it's sort of not just about one technology company or one group of wealthy investors coming out of the valley, for instance, but partnerships across the public sector, local government, community-based organizations to problem solve. I think that's how we're going to get there.
And as you look at the work that you've done, and that maybe more broadly this administration has done over the last 8 years or so, and there have been so many advances across the different areas that affect sustainability, right? From water to climate to transportation. What specific areas are you most proud of? And maybe parlaying that into what lies next in terms of the most important areas for the state to focus on?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think looking back over these past now 7, almost 8 years, I'd say I'm most proud of the kind of the crescendo of California's ambition with regard to our kind of policies on with our climate change goals. So, we established a goal beyond 2020 to 2030, and we followed through with commitments in the areas of energy efficiency, renewable energy, zero emission vehicles, thinking through land use and how we grow. And we did so and have done so, I think, in the face of not as great ambition at the federal level, and this is pre-2016, and then now in the face of pretty tremendous headwinds coming from our federal government, and we've really, I think, shown our worth globally, on the global stage, and how we did so, I think, is what I'm maybe most proud of. Like looking to where we were in 2008 in the comments about California as a failed economy, comparisons at the time, I think, to Greece and, the wall of debt, 20 billion plus that we had. It's kind of astonishing that, now looking back, we're able to call ourselves the 5th largest economy now in the world. And we are leading on the climate front. That to me is something to be proud of. Looking ahead, and this is maybe not surprising, I do think that there continues to be an evolving conversation around equity and what that really means, socioeconomically, in terms of race. As we look to transform our economy, we're creating new jobs, we're creating new opportunities, and how are those jobs and opportunities available to those with different levels of education, addressing, as sort of hyper income inequality, our housing crisis. We are certainly not out of the woods yet as we think about, I think, our polis, as it were, and to my mind, equity and discussions around equity are at the core. We're I think at the fore though of those discussions with our intentional focus through laws like SB 535 and AB 1550, which actually identified these communities that are most burdened, most impacted, and I think put a really intentional screen across sort of making sure that our investments are directed to those places. So I think a tremendous foot in the right direction. AB 617, which I think you'll hear about more when you chat with others that are directing large sums of money directly in the most impacted communities. So we're making tremendous strides, but I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out, okay, when the money is distributed, when it makes it to these communities, what does implementation actually entail? How are the lives of people who've not really felt part of, all these sort of, rosy-eyed and I think rightfully idealistic goals that I've been describing? They haven't felt a part of that. How can we ensure that they both feel and actually are a part of that?
So I want to end by bringing it back to your career. And first, just a question. Does your appointment term out in 2018, or does it extend into the next administration?
So it extends until a new council decides to appoint a new executive director. So yeah, it goes as I serve at the pleasure of the council.
And what opportunities are you most interested yourself? Not necessarily next year, but just in the future. You've again come at this from a few different angles. What does the future hold for Randall Winston?
Oh boy, a big question there, David. There's a lot still happening this year. So we didn't talk about the Global Climate Action Summit, which is happening in September, and that's maybe obviously a pretty huge undertaking on the part of this administration and work that I've been involved in. And so I see myself kind of running through the tape a little bit insofar as that event.
Could you talk a little bit about the summit since we didn't cover that?
Sure. So, kind of going back to what I see as California's now global role insofar as fighting climate change and making sure that we can follow through with our commitments, there is a level of ambition, I think, that we've, as California, have sought to make sure that our partners are commensurate with regard to the Paris Agreement from the last Conference of Parties. And again, in light of the sort of lack of leadership at the federal level, what can California do in league with other subnational governments, other national governments to, not just sort of maintain that ambition, but increase it, ramp it up. The summit is about bringing together those leaders, bringing together those commitments across a host of sectors, including business, including philanthropy, including elected officials, including community-based organizations from the global north, the global south, and making not just our voices heard, but our actions sort of seen and committed to, frankly. And so I think it'll be an exciting summit. It's taking place in San Francisco in mid-September. And so that is a large chunk of my own work at the moment. Beyond that, though, I'll some of it will be a sort of wait and see. We've got the midterms, the next presidential election in 2020. I maintain will not certainly not change my own sort of commitment to public service and passion for public service. Whether that's articulated though or sort of seen through on the policy front, more of a political front, potentially in academia, I don't know quite yet. All of it is interesting. I kind of have become a believer in letting that passion kind of guide my decisions and not necessarily what might be considered a sort of linear progression in terms of a career. I think that was sort of out of the window for me, back in maybe the end of college when I decided to head off to Beijing. But that's exciting. There's a chance to do, in spite of our political division or sets of divisions nationally, I think is an opportunity to really sort of refashion, from the standpoint of democratic, progressive values and politics and people, refashion our both our platform, I think from a policy or political perspective, and hopefully the political discourse, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier. That's a really long-winded way, Dave, of saying I don't know. Keeping my options open, and kind of right now being focused a lot on what on the work.
Well, I'd just say that the state and the country and the environment need your continued work. So I'm glad that you're as passionate as ever about it.
Well, thank you. And thank you again so much for having me.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.